The Life of Saint Jerome by Father Largent, Chapter 5, Part 2, Contentions, Rufinus and Arianism. In the funeral oration of the priest Nepotian, from which we extract this tragic account, Jerome wrote, "At that time there were discussions in our midst, and before the scandal of our domestic quarrels, the invasions of the barbarians sank into insignificance. How often, in the most troublous times, men under the menace or the blow of calamity have persisted in private contentions or in scientific controversies, which distracted attention from the sight of the universal misery. Can one wonder at this? Is not man generally most struck by what he hears or sees in his immediate surroundings? And are not the interests and ideas to which he has devoted his life the object of his principal and most constant preoccupation? Does it seem strange or wrong that Jerome should have continued to wage his ceaseless war against Arianism and other errors in the midst of all the sorrow and horror of those disastrous days? No doubt, unworthy sentiments may sometimes have mingled with the lofty motives which actuated him. He may have been mistaken in his judgments, and given vent to undue violence in his language. But what, however, remains an undeniable fact is that the hermit of Bethlehem desired before everything the triumph of truth, which at all times deserves to triumph and should ever be defended. It was this which occasioned the struggles which Jerome and later Augustine, Leo the Great, Gregory the Great, and so many illustrious doctors of the Church maintained against heresy amid evils so desperate that they seemed to herald the approaching end of the world. These great men excelled in the saving and the encouragement of stricken but shrinking souls. But they did not forget the eternal truth is the primary blessing and the supreme refuge of every soul, and without allowing themselves to be discouraged or turn from their purposes, so they continue to proclaim its imprescriptible rights. Isidorus, the priest, after a repulse, which was but too clearly foreseen, returned to Alexandria in 396. Theophilus came himself to Jerusalem, but his sympathies were entirely with John and his censure for Jerome. "You advise me to observe the canons of the Church," wrote Jerome. "I thank you for this warning, and for whom the Lord loveth his chasteneth and scourgeth every son whom he receiveth. Know this, however, nothing is nearer to my heart than to keep the law of Christ, not to exceed the limits imposed by the fathers, and never to forget the Roman faith which is englozed by the apostle, and which is the glory of the Alexandrian Church to share." The reconciliation, however, took place. The Patriarch of Alexandria, who had hitherto defended Origen, changed his opinions. Did he realize in a sudden illumination of the conscience as theory that Origen, who was very excellent and useful in the hands of the learned, presented a real danger to the ignorant? Did he see that the needs of the soul are not the same for everyone, and that a far-seeing priest should remove from the pathway of the simple the stumbling block which the philosopher or the theologian would avoid? It is possible that he did, for Theophilus united a thorough knowledge of men to his theological science. Yet there are other and less praiseworthy motives which account for this change in his conduct. It was entirely to the interest of the persecutor of the monks, known as Long Brothers, to the jealous and passionate adventurousy of St. John Chrysostom, henceforth to regard the Arianism imputed to his enemies as a most pernicious heresy. From that moment, Epiphanius and Jerome, who were antagonistic to Origen's doctrines, became dear to the Patriarch and were treated by him as patriarchs. John of Jerusalem, who was an indifferent theologian, and who, moreover, preferred the authority of the Patriarch of Alexandria to the nearer and more inconvenient supervision of the Metropolitan of Caesarea, followed, or at least did not thwart from the former in his evolution, and removed all the interdictions which had been laid upon the monks at Bethlehem. Rufinus, fired by the example of his bishop, made some advances toward Jerome, and they were both reconciled in the Church of the Resurrection at Jerusalem, where together they partook of the Holy Sacrament. This was in 397. Jerome's reconciliation with John was sincere. I think, said Tillemont, that Jerome will not be found to have said anything after this animated quarrel was over that could have injured the bishop's reputation. John had, at the time of the Pelagian controversy, displayed the same faults of character which he had shown in the Origenist controversies, and through a culpable inaction, which strangely resembled complicity, identified himself with the persecutors of the hermit. A fierce and inexorable war broke out afresh between Jerome and Rufinus, but before retelling its painful incidents, let us draw attention to the aggression to which Jerome was subjected by Vigilantius, a Spaniard in whom Polanian had been deceived when he commended him to Jerome, and also of Jerome's answer to it. Vigilantius accused Jerome of Origenism, alleging the extracts which the hermit had taken from the works of the great Alexandrian. Further, it is for this that this forerunner of the heretical leaders of the 16th century is best known, and that he most deserved Jerome's condemnations. Vigilantius rejected the invocation of the saints, the cult of relics, the prayers for the dead, the practice of fasting, and the celibacy of priests and monks. Jerome had no difficulty in refuting the accusation of Origenism, but he was better employed than in his own defense. With a logical eloquence and force which did not shrink from personalities, he also refuted the objections of Vigilantius, and put in their proper light the sacred and historical character of the dogmas and usages against which the audacious innovator was rebelling. Heliodorus, a friend of Jerome's, and for some time a companion in his travels, had an unusually gifted nephew called Nepotenius. At the beginning of his career, he had been engaged in the emperor's service, and having set the same example to the court of Theodosius, which in after years Francis Borgia and Louis of Gonzaga were to give the courts of Charles V and Philip II, he renounced a world which had never given him any cause for disillusionment, and consecrated himself to the ministry of the altar. Jerome on this occasion wrote him a famous letter in which he enumerated the austere duties of the sacerdotal life. Amongst many other lessons to be found in it is the following, which applies to all preachers, and which Fenelon has inserted in his third dialogue upon eloquence. When teaching in the church, do not excite the applause, but rather the lamentations of the people. Let the tears of your auditors be by your commendation. The sermons of a priest should overflow with Holy Scripture. Be not an orator, but a sincere expounder of the mysteries of your God. This letter was written in 394, a few years later. In 396, this young man, whom Heliodorus had vainly counted on as a successor to his episcopal see of Antino, was smitten by death, and Jerome, in an eloquent letter, while lamenting the friend he was losing, strove to console the friend who still remained. In it, he depicted the serene death of the youthful priest, and in a delicate and touching passage reminded him that the last thoughts of the dying man had been turned towards him. His face wore a look of joy. Amid the tearful onlookers, he alone smiled. You would have thought not that he was dying, but that he was about to start a long journey. Not that he was leaving his friends, but that he was going to find others. Who would believe that at this supreme moment he should have remembered our friendship, and that his soul should have been sensible to the sweetness of our mutual affection, even in the throes of death? Having taken his uncle's hand, he said, Send this vestment, which I wore in Christ's service, to my beloved father, and yours, my brother, by the union of priesthood, in all the affection due to your nephew expend on him, whom with me you already love. This funeral oration, for such it really is, which is a precursor of many latter masterpieces of a Christian eloquence, contains, as we have already said, a vivid picture of the evils which were then devastating the world, and closes with a reference to the vanity and frailty of things human. Let us rouse ourselves. Do you know the instant in which you pass from childhood to youth, from youth to man's estate, and finally to old age? Each day brings death and change to us, and yet we believe ourselves to be immortal. Even when I'm dictating what is being written, and what I shall reread is so much cut off from my life, we write and write again. Our letters cross the seas, the vessels plow through the waves, and each wave carries with it an instant of our life. The Christian, the priest, however, does not dwell long upon these melancholy thoughts, but turns his gaze to higher things. Our only blessing, Jerome continues, is our union with Christ, and our union with one another in this charity of Christ. Charity is undying. It lives internally in the hearts of men. Through it, Nipotonius, although departed, is still with us, and across the space which divides us, still clasps our hands in his. We cannot linger over these touching pages, for we must return to the Origenist choral, which again sprang into life and distracted Jerome from his work. I might almost say from his sorrow. Rufinus started for Rome, and on arriving in the internal city, he met a man called Marcus, a man of the world, a distinguished, he says, by his faith, his nobility, and his life, who was occupied at the time in defending in a special treatise the dogma of the divine providence against the fatalistic error and misleading fancies of astrology. The difficulties of such an abstruse subject frequently brought him to a standstill, but firmly believing in a dream, he expected someone who would soon give him its solution. He believed Rufinus to be the man his dream predicted, for could not Rufinus, who had just returned from Palestine, who was familiar with Christian literature in the East, and who knew Origen, whose fame had penetrated into the Latin world so thoroughly, could not he initiate Marcus, probably an ignorant, or at least indifferent scholar of Greek, into the works of the celebrated Alexandrian, and thus allow him to draw from his vast wells of thought. Rufinus also believed that he was the man, and translated for his friend first the Apology of Origen by the holy martyr Pamphilus, and afterwards the Periocon, the book of fundamental doctrines. This last undertaking entailed considerable risk. For all of Origen's work, none had awakened so much distrust or called forth the censure of orthodoxy more than Periocon. Rufinus was fully aware of this, and he owns that he only presented an expurgated copy to the Latins, in which he extracts from other works of Origen explained and completed from the obscure passages. One cannot deny, says Messenger Freppel, that Rufinus exceeded his privileges of translator. He remodeled the original text from an entirely personal point of view, and even where it admitted, as in fact we do admit, that he has rightly grasped Origen's thoughts upon the question of the Trinity, he should not have permitted to recast any part whatsoever of the work. In the preface to his translations, Rufinus justified his timidity, cited the example given by St. Jerome, for although he does not actually name him, his manner of praising him, and the mention of the works which the hermit of Bethlehem had already translated, sufficiently indicate whom he meant. Rufinus declared that he was following in the footsteps of one greater than himself. If Jerome sometimes corrected the Book of Fundamental Doctrines, was he not the first to suppress or modify anything in his version of the homilies of Origen at which the austere orthodoxy of the Latins might take exception? Through a bold stroke, Rufinus gained 2 points. For on one hand, he reinstated Origen, and the Alexandrian, who until then had been under suspicion, returned to Rome. If not victorious, at least acquitted. And on the other, he associated with his cause and with the cause of Origen the man who formerly in Palestine had, with Epiphanius and Theophilus, been his most bitter adversary. In Jerome's eyes, Origenism was at the time the Church's greatest peril. He therefore rejected those compromising theologies, and this determinable solidity. solitary. Besides, he also thought that it was better to resolutely broach the most unorthodox of the great Alexandrian's works, and expose its audacities and errors, than to give the misled Romans a modified and therefore a deceptive version of the Periacan. He accordingly undertook a complete translation of his work, which however is no longer extant. In his correspondence, Jerome gives an explanation of his past conduct, of the works in which he had exalted Origen, and the admiration he had evinced for him. The following passage is extracted from a letter written to Oceanus, and to Apollo's son-in-law, Pammachius. It atones for the injury which Jerome's translation of the malicious pamphlet of Theophilus did to the great man's memory, and it will please those of our time who, without disputing the errors by which the bold and subtle Alexandrian was led astray, still honor him for his virtues and labors. If you wish to praise Origen, says Jerome, praise him as I do. He was great, even from childhood, and the true son of a martyr. He governed the Christian school in Alexandria, where he had succeeded the learned priest Clement. He abhorred license and trampled upon avarice. He knew the scriptures by heart, and his days and nights were spent in the study of Holy Writ. What one of us could read all that he has written? Who could fail to admire his intense love for the scriptures? And if some Judas, in bitter zeal, should allege his errors, we will reply boldly. Homer becomes at times lethargic. It is not excusable in a long poem. Let us not copy the errors of one whose virtues we are unable to imitate. In Rome, the translation of Rufinus had greatly excited all who had Jerome's reputation and the cause of orthodoxy at heart. Marcella, the ascetic's learned friend, was among the first to perceive the danger. At first she kept silence through modesty, but as she saw it growing, she warned him of it. Rufinus, afraid of the storm which seemed to be gathering, left Rome and, provided by Pope Syracuse with credentials, returned to Aquileia. It was under Anastasius, the successor of Syracuse, that Origenism received its death blows in the east and in the west. Theophilus prosecuted it in his Patriarchate of Alexandria with a zeal tinged with a fierce love of power and an intolerance of all contradiction. He even pretended to discover it among the monks of Nitra, guilty of having defended the good cause, and in John Chrysostom, their protector. Jerome joined in this campaign by translating the synodical letters of Theophilus, and possibly even an odious pamphlet, whose authorship Fancundus of Hermon, an author of the 6th century, attributes to the patriarch. It is more, wrote Telemon, than for his honor we could wish to believe. Jerome, however, joined in his contention with unquestionable sincerity, for Theophilus, whom he only saw from afar, seemed to him an intrepid champion of the faith. In 400, a Roman council, the acts of which have been lost, condemned the errors of Origen. The confession of faith which Rufinus sent to Pope Anastasius was completely orthodox, and there is nothing to prove that the censure of Anastasius was directed against him and many more than against all those who had propagated erroneous or dangerous books. The friendship of venerable personages like St. Polonius of Nolo, St. Chromatius of Aquileia, and St. Gaudenius of Brescia, which Rufinus always retained, testified to the purity of his faith. Rufinus was overbold. He let loose a whirlwind in which his reputation nearly perished, but he was never heretical. Did his charity, as well as his faith, emerge intact from these painful conflicts? Anyone who has read his apology, his invectives against Jerome, for such is the name which he clung to this work, can only answer in the negative. He devoted 3 years to this work, says Amedi Theory, which appeared fragment by fragment. He divided it into 2 books, to which he later added a supplement. He had a double aim, first to exonerate himself from the crime of heresy by casting upon Jerome the accusation directed towards him, and then to dishonor Jerome and to throw odium on his name by personal imputations, lamenting the while being forced to such measures. Indeed, no pamphlet has ever been composed with more cunning hatred, nor has ever struck the adversary more surely. It was the man whom Rufinus aimed at in the writer. We will not linger over the regionism of which Jerome was accused, greatly on the strength of extracts from his own writings. Why should not Jerome have shared the privilege common to all authors of explaining, and if necessary, of retracting his former writings? He certainly cannot be accused of having been actuated by personal interest. The mistake which he made, if indeed it was a mistake, was in contradicting himself. The venom of Rufinus sought other outlets. According to him, Jerome was the enemy of mankind, a traducer of the faithful whose customs he had calumniated in his book upon virginity, at the risk of justifying and even magnifying the calumnies of the pagans. A traducer of the faithful whose customs he had calumniated in his book upon virginity, at the risk of justifying and even magnifying the calumnies of the pagans. A traducer of the works of Ambrose, the great bishop. A traducer of Rome, the capital of the Christian world, and a traducer of all authors, either Greek or Latin, who had preceded him. One grievance which Rufinus put forward with malignant insistence was the important part the pagan authors played in Jerome's works, and in his thoughts. In vain had Jerome, after a famous vision, swore never to reopen any secular book. Pursue his writings and see if there is a single page which does not point to his having again become a Ciceronian, and in which he does not speak of our Cicero, our Homer, our Virgil. He even boasts of having read the works of Pythagoras, which according to the erudite are no longer in existence. In almost all the works, quotations from secular authors are far more numerous and lengthy than those from the prophets and apostles. Even when writing to women or maidens, who in our holy books seek only subjects for edification, he intersperes his letters with quotations from Horace, Cicero, or Virgil. He was guilty of a still graver offense. In the monastery at Bethlehem, Jerome performed the office of grammarian, and he expounded Virgil, the humorist, synist, and historians to children who had been confided to him to be inspired with the fear of God. The hermit, enamored as he was of pagan law, had recourse to the erudition of the Hebrew doctor Susi's Tem in his biblical works. He preferred these masters to any others because they alone preserved the truth of the scriptures. Rufinus was certainly not wanting in learning, yet partly through his violent antipathy to Jerome, partly through mental cowardice, the strange champion of religion took the side of routine and ignorance against the aesthetic. The smallest change introduced by Jerome into the accepted translations of the sacred works, for example, the substitution of one word for another, roused the indignation of Rufinus. Now that the world is waxing old, and all things are drawing near the end, he exclaimed, "Let us write upon the tombs of the ancients." The touchingly symbolic picture of Jonas asleep was frequently reproduced upon these tombs. Let us write so as to inform those who have not read it in their Bibles that Jonas reposed in the shades of an ivy and not in the shade of a gourd. He was sometimes very crafty in his criticisms, for example, when he reapproached Jerome with the doubts of which it was well known that he entertained of the canonicity of several portions of the book of Daniel. In the next breath, however, placing the legends which vainly aspire to be called traditions upon the same footing as the dogmatic traditions of the Church, Rufinus condemned as a crime Jerome's rejection of the fable of the 72 old men who, detained by order of Ptolemy, Philadelphus, king of Egypt, each in a separate cell, came forth with an identical version of the Bible. On more than one occasion and under various forms, he put this question with which men have often tried to discourage the apostles of the most legitimate movements. Who of all of the great men, your predecessors dare embark upon the world which ye have undertaken? The family of Rufinus, which was brought to Jerome by his brother Polanian, demanded an answer. It was surely the hermit's right, his duty even to refuse accusations which defamed both his character and his works. He accordingly answered his adversaries' invectives by an apology. And theory tells us that Jerome was never more inspired than in these pages, which contain theological discussions, self-justification, denouncement of the enemy, lamentations, and finally anger, which is when his indignation overcame him. The treachery of his style, the flow of language, the force of argument, all were indeed marvelous. The Apology of Rufinus doubtless bears stamps of great talent, but Jerome's that of a genius. We must acknowledge that Jerome's wrath, which was justifiable when restrained within due limits, vented itself in regrettable personalities. Several years later, a letter to Rusticius, describing the happiness of a monastic life, and full of the most affectingly tender passages, Jerome sketched a picture worthy of the humorist and the satirist, Plautus and Juvenal, whose works he was reproached for reading, but which he probably knew by heart. He dubbed this picture Granibus, and it has never been denied that it was Rufinus. He started portray. At the time of this letter, which dates from 408, the ancient athlete was not yet disabled, and the passage of this commentary upon Ezekiel, written after the death of Rufinus, seems to prove that he never became so. It is true that other saints have left a reputation of greater gentleness and clemency than did the hermit of Bethlehem. Let us recall the words of Pope Sixtus V, who, passing one day before a picture representing Jerome in the act of striking his breast with a stone, cried, "You do well to hold that pebble in your hand, for without it the church would never have canonized you." Rufinus, driven from Aquileia by the invasion of the Goths, retired to Sicily, where he pursued his labors of history and translation until his death there in 410. Thank you for joining me again in the life of St. Jerome. I hope you guys come back next week, and we'll see you in the next one. Have a great day, night, morning, or whatever time of day it is for you guys, and may God bless you all.